Hey, welcome back to Common Ground. This is going to be our bridge episode. So we have done Genesis 1 through 9 at this point. We've gone from the garden straight through to the flood and the waters receding. And after this, we're going to move forward into a different part of the story where things kind of start to pick up and feel like they're going a bit faster. So I wanted to do a bridge episode before we get to that point because I'm thinking back to how church was for me and how we would go to church and hear these stories, and they did feel larger than life. And there's certain things that we remembered, like David and Goliath, Noah and the ark, Jonah and the whale. But they stayed larger than life to me as I grew up and started wanting to learn more about what actually happened and what these stories mean in my life, or what they could mean in my life. And so I want to take a moment to really slow down and look back over what we have covered, what we have learned, what it could mean to us, because I feel like these stories kind of stack on top of one another and they get blurry and names may be forgotten, events may feel like they're just blending into the next. And so I don't want this to ever feel like it's creating a sense of pressure like it used to for me in church. So I just want to take a moment to remember and kind of go back over some of the details that we've covered. So we'll start with the garden. Of course, by that meaning the Garden of Eden. And we went from a world of chaos and darkness to there was sense, there was purpose. The chaos turned into order, everything had its place. And then the world that was introduced to us in the story is a world that was good. At the end of every single day, it says that the Creator looked at what He created and it was good. And humans were told to live inside of that goodness without any kind of fear, without any sense of self protection. We learned this because of after what happened with the serpent, then suddenly they were afraid and they needed to cover their nakedness. But prior to the serpent, there was no hiding, there was no comparison, there was no sense of shame. There was just a garden where everything was working together in order. And we also learned that this creator God was walking with them. And so being known by this creator felt safe. And to me, this symbolizes a relationship where nothing has been fractured yet. Everything is safe and it is okay. So we covered the first distance that was felt between humans, and this brought a sense of awareness of being less than, awareness of shame, and this resulted in hiding. And so at this point in the story, humans became aware of themselves in a new way. It wasn't a way that felt good to them, obviously, because they immediately wanted to cover themselves and be hidden. I thought it was really endearing to note here though that they didn't respond by rebelling. They simply hid. That was really important. And they covered themselves and they avoided the presence of this creator, maybe so he wouldn't think less of them. But he moved toward them and he didn't seem to think less of them. He asked questions. He didn't interrogate them. He didn't ask questions that were blaming, but he helped them orient to what was actually going on. He asked them, "Where are you?" And so I noticed from this that even from the very beginning of this story, that when distance was created, our creator, and in this book, God closed that distance and he came closer. So from the story of the garden where Adam and Eve have been sent out of the garden to now go and live elsewhere, Cain and Abel were born, and this was what I saw as the first big human conflict that we're learning about in this story. These were brothers. They both wanted to matter as much as the other. They both wanted to feel important, I'm sure, as we do as humans. And we read that one of them felt seen, one of them felt noticed, and the other one felt overlooked, and he was not acknowledged. And so we learned from this that the anger built, the anger grew, and then there was violence. And I think it's great to note here that God actually again approached Cain before the violence, before the action of killing his brother. And he offered another moment for orientation, another moment to say, is this really how you want this to be? So it was an invitation. It was a chance to choose differently and have control of your life. But the harm still happened. The fear, the shame, the anger, whatever the emotion was, it was too big. So the violence happened. And even after that, God still met Cain. My bunny is hopping all over the room listening. God still met Cain where he was. and he still offered to protect him. He put a mark on him and said that anyone who sees this mark, they will know not to touch you, because if they do, they're going to suffer for it. So this was again illustrating boundaries and consequences, as we saw in the beginning with the trees in the garden, but care was also still existing because Cain was being protected. So we went through the generations of family after that, and we learned that the closer men stayed to God, closer mankind stayed to walking the path of righteousness, walking in relation with God, and we looked at the definitions of these words. We learned that they were set apart and they were held differently. For instance, Enoch, he is not stated to have died the same way as the other men that we heard about in these generations. And we also learned that Noah was set apart because the way that he walked with the Lord. It was also interesting to note that the further these generations got from the garden and the further these generations got from that close walking with the Creator, the shorter their lives got. And we read that as these families grew, the harm spread. And so these weren't just small moments anymore that were these clear points that we could reach out to in these stories and say, yes, this was a moment of harm. Instead, the harm became patterns. It became family inheritance that was passed down. Songs were made about it. So this story is describing a world where people stopped recognizing one another as needing connection. They stopped noticing that that was the priority. Instead, violence started to become normal, and the distance between humans and the Creator got even wider. But throughout all of that, the Creator still kept engaging. He was not ever absent. He was not ever indifferent to the suffering. There was always grief language involved, and he was always responding to what was happening with these humans. Then we got to the flood, which a lot of people, for me growing up, said that this was a punishment for the world because we were so evil and wicked. But to me, I actually read this as a form of preservation. This ark was basically a life raft, and everything that held the breath of life was sent inside to be preserved. And so to me, I didn't read this as abandonment. I felt like something very precious and sacred was being carried through the chaos and not allowed to be erased by it. And in speaking of chaos, I think it was really cool that the chaos and the waters that existed in the beginning of Genesis, at the beginning of creation, were exactly the same force that came and carried the ark through, but undid the rest of creation. So to me, this ark seemed to be a shelter and a smaller version of the garden almost, because we had chaos around the ark, but there was so much order within, so many numbered pairs and the exact amount of things that we need to survive. So while this was happening inside, the outside was completely resetting. And when it ended, we ended with reading about how God made a promise that was completely independent of any kind of human effort. You guys don't have to do anything because I'm making this covenant already preemptively ahead of time. And every time I see this bow in the cloud, I will remember this. So there was a sign that was placed in the sky, not just in human memory. This is not just something for the humans to pass down to their generations. It's something that can be seen. And it's a testament that this relationship is going to continue. So even just in these first 9 chapters, we've already gone through so much. We've experienced closeness, we've experienced distance, harm from that, shame, escalation, but we've also experienced a sense of protection and preservation and the promise that came from that. And so what I have noticed in chapters 1 through 9 of Genesis is that the Creator, God, has consistently moved toward the people and also tried to meet them where they were at. He didn't ever ask them to be perfect. Even after the ark, we noticed that Noah went and got drunk and still more harm happened. And yet there was still the promise that was still there. So this story from here is about to go from humanity as a whole to talking about very specific families. But I've already read ahead, and I'm coming back and I'm doing this after the fact with my notes already done. And so I noticed that this is still following the same relational pattern throughout all of these stories that we're about to dive into, but it's going to be zoomed in more on specific people. And I feel that this helps us recognize the pattern even more easily because we kind of get to know these people. We get to know more about them. We get to read about what's happening in their life. And so I wanted to make this bridge episode before we dive into that for people who maybe like me felt like they couldn't keep the Bible straight inside of your head, or you weren't really sure who they were talking about, or you couldn't quite remember the story that they were talking about when someone was sharing this with you. But I want to intersperse these episodes within the study to just remind us like there's a movement happening here and there are themes happening here. And so far, what we've seen is that this is a relationship that continues to reach out, continues to reach for closeness, even when there's distance, even when there's shame. And so, as we're moving forward into these next chapters, and as you're integrating this bridge episode and looking back on everything that we've learned, I would invite you to just ask yourself, is there anywhere in your life where you have noticed movement like that? And that could be the movement of closeness and wanting to be closer in connection to one another, or in distance and moving away and not wanting to be seen in something. We had the movement of survival and the things that humans do to ensure their survival and to feel safe. And we also have the movement of promise that no matter what happens, this thing is going to be true and we can count on it. And I think it would be really cool if we just took a moment to journal or to think about what this could be mirroring back to us in our life. Because my goal with this always is that you can take what's meaningful and take what applies for you, and maybe it will be helpful in some way. Maybe it will be enlightening, or maybe it won't. And always I say, leave what doesn't resonate for you, leave it here. But definitely to carry with you what you take from this into your week, because I've noticed that when I focus my attention on something, number one, it's there, it's brought to my attention for a reason. But number two, it often follows these themes in my life, and a lot of things follow suit, and patterns start to connect, dots start to connect. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense why I would find this now. So I'm going to share a few more resources this week that you can click on, maybe some YouTube videos, maybe some blog posts that you can read or watch. But this is really going to be a week of looking back and reflecting and just seeing what we can take from this so far and what we want to carry forward with us as we move into these next chapters.